Hello. I hope that this will be a little bit faster than the last one. I do feel like we take quite a long time to do these. But at the same time, this is an immensely important issue that's affecting so many people's lives. And I hope that even though, um, in some small way, maybe I can provide a public service by helping to elucidate and elaborate on some of the mathematics and science that is going on behind the scenes in the corona modeling. Um, I had originally hoped to avoid the term corona and COVID because of all of the hysteria that YouTube will filter out your video if you use these words, and no one will ever see it, and you'll get striked or banned or something. I don't know. But I've come to the realization that if I'm going to be reading out reports, as I am today, that are all about coronavirus and COVID 19, I am not going to be able to avoid these terms. And I'm not going to try to avoid these terms. It's just unreasonable. Um, and what I'm about to read out to you is the famous report that is believed to have precipitated the lockdown in the UK, the modelling reports that suggested that the situation could be much worse than people initially imagined, and that extreme social distancing was the only option. Um, is very much the conclusion that paper reached, and we're going to go through that paper now. And hopefully it's all going to be very elucidating, and we're going to be able to critique it, we're going to be able to dissect it, and we're going to be able to get an understanding as to how the conclusions were reached and what the methodologies were. Um, and I was going to read out highlighted sections, but to be frank, the entire thing just needs to be read. I tried dissecting it out, and it's impossible. I might as well just read the whole thing. Virtually everything was highlighted. I've put in a couple of notes to help remind me, because I've gone through it so many times now. I have a number of points to make and a number of things I want to elaborate upon. Um, but I'm just going to read it verbatim. And of course, it's under Creative Commons license, so that should be fine. This is non-profit after all. So, to go straight to it, Report 9, Impact of Non-Pharmaceutical Interventions, NPIs, to reduce COVID-19 mortality and healthcare demand. You have this long list of authors, mostly relating to Imperial College London. And of course, the first name on the list will be quite familiar to those of you that have been following the news recently. Neil M. Ferguson, the advisor on SAGE, who was recently forced or otherwise felt the need to resign because he did not adhere to the lockdown rules. These are kind of easy to kind of say, physician, heal thyself, or something like that, but I'm not here to criticize, I'm here to dissect the science. Um, Not to criticize people's personal choices. So we will begin at the beginning. The global impact of COVID-19 has been profound, and the public health threat it represents is the most serious seen in a respiratory virus since the 1918 H1N1 influenza pandemic. Here we present the results of the epidemiological modelling, which has informed the policy making in the UK and other countries in recent weeks. In the absence of the COVID-19 vaccine, we assess the potential role of a number of public health measures. It's quite worth pointing out that they really don't talk very much about any scenario that involves a vaccine here, and that's relevant later on. So-called non-pharmaceutical interventions, aimed at reducing contact rates in the population and thereby reducing transmission of a virus. In the results presented here, we apply a previously published micro-simulation model to two countries, the UK and Great Britain specifically, and the US, we conclude that the effectiveness of any one intervention in isolation is likely to be limited, requiring multiple interventions to be combined to have a substantial impact on transmission. Two fundamental strategies are possible: mitigation, which focuses on slowing but not necessarily stopping epidemic spread, reducing peak healthcare demand while protecting those most at risk of disease from the infection, and B, suppression, which aims to reverse epidemic growth, reducing case numbers to low levels and maintaining that situation indefinitely. Each policy has major challenges. We find that optimal mitigation policies combined home isolation of suspected cases, home quarantine of those living in the same households as suspect cases, and social distancing of the elderly and others most at risk of severe disease might reduce peak healthcare demand by 2/3 and deaths by a half. However, the resulting mitigated epidemic would still likely result in hundreds of thousands of deaths and health systems, most notably intensive care units, being overwhelmed many times over. For countries able to achieve it, this leaves suppression as the preferred policy option. We show that in the UK and US context, suppression will minimally require a combination of social distancing of the entire population, home isolation of cases, and household quarantine of their family members. This may need to be supplemented by school and university closures, though it should be recognized that such closures may have negative impacts on health systems due to increased absenteeism. The major challenge of suppression is that this type of intensive intervention package, or something equivalently effective at reducing transmission, will need to be maintained until a vaccine becomes available, potentially 18 months or more. Given that we predict that transmission will quickly rebound if interventions are relaxed, we show that intermittent social distancing triggered by trends in disease surveillance may allow interventions to be relaxed temporarily in relatively short time windows, but measures will need to be reintroduced if or when case numbers rebound. Last, while experience in China and now South Korea shows that suppression is possible in the short term, it remains to be seen whether it is possible in the long term, and whether the social and economic costs of the interventions adopted thus far can be reduced. And that is, in and of itself, very definitely worth talking about, the social and economic costs of the interventions. But we'll come on to that later. That summary is probably what a lot of people reading this document would stop and not read any further, because these documents tend to be prepared for busy people, and they don't always want to read through it. Now, obviously, people who have to read through it, who need to be making very serious decisions, you would hope would be reading it in great detail with great care. But I know, having prepared documents myself, that generally speaking, as soon as a technobabble starts, people have a tendency to switch off. And there is a temptation sometimes to put all of your conclusions at the top, which then sometimes means that people don't read the caveats down below, all the details about the ifs, or buts, or maybes that come alongside it. So let's read those ifs, buts, and maybes, and let's take them apart a bit. It's Creative Commons there. So, the COVID-19 pandemic is now a major global health threat. As of 16th of March 2020, there have been 164,837 cases and 6,470 deaths confirmed worldwide. Global spread has been rapid, with 146 countries now having reported at least one case. The last time the world responded to a global emerging disease epidemic of the scale of the current COVID-19 pandemic with no access to vaccines was the 1918-19 H1N1 influenza pandemic. In that pandemic, some communities, notably the United States, responded with a variety of non-pharmaceutical intervention measures. intended to reduce transmission by reducing contact rates in the general population. Examples of the measures adopted during this time included closing schools, churches, bars, and other social venues. Cities in which these interventions were implemented early on in the epidemic were successful at reducing case numbers, while the interventions remained in place and experienced lower mortality overall. However, transmission rebounded once controls were lifted. What was my note here? Very different. Yes. It's worth pointing out that that was a very different world. So it's very difficult to take physical data, and there have been attempts to take physical data from the death rates back in those historical pandemics and try and infer how social distancing um, affected the way people behaved and affected the way a pandemic spread. But of course, the thing is, we live in a totally different world now where we have the internet, where people can do things like work from home, where people can do things like get in a car and just drive somewhere. Now, most people have cars. Back then, most people didn't. Air travel is a thing now. Um, Rail travel is a thing now. Um, it's I mean a real big thing. People move about differently. People have different activities. People go to different places. Yeah, so it's really difficult to infer things from that data, and yeah, it's a different world now. And of course, back then in Great Britain, we didn't even tell people that there was a pandemic. There was a war on. We needed them to be out and working and doing, but the entire nation was on a war footing. We couldn't just put things on hold, ask people to not go out. The nation wouldn't survive. And so they weren't told that there was a pandemic. And yes, sure, there was economic damage, but life went on, and people really didn't notice because compared to the war, it didn't seem that big a deal. Of course, it was a big deal, and we lost lots of people, but society as a whole was quite robust to it. Um, yeah, so yeah, but what we do know from those times is that artificially reducing the the transmission rates, when they let it up, it did indeed rebound. It rebounded, and actually, one of the ironies is the places where it did rebound, the overall impact was actually worse than if they'd done nothing at all. If they'd have not implemented social distancing, it would have been better. At least that's what the numbers suggest. And again, I'm saying it's very difficult to extrapolate models on these old data sets. But the modelling suggests that they would have had a better time of it if they'd not locked down, if they'd not done social distancing, as opposed to having done it and then let go of it at the stage that they did. Because as long as there's that potential as long as there's fuel of uninfected people uh, without an immunity for the virus to go through, it can come back and it can actually end up being worse. Whilst our understanding of infectious diseases and their prevention is now very different compared to 1918, most of the countries across the world face the same challenge today with COVID-19, a virus with comparable lethality to H1N1 influenza in 1918. Two fundamental strategies are possible. A. Suppression. Here we aim to reduce the reproduction number, the average number of secondary cases each case generates, R, to below 1, and hence reduce the case numbers to low levels. Now remember we're talking about R naught. R naught is a kind of the inherent at the start of a pandemic, how many people will be at the start of a pandemic, assuming everyone you come into contact with is susceptible. How many people are you going to infect if you're infected? That's your R naught. Now R changes over time because as the pandemic goes on, you might come into contact with people who are immune. You might have fewer options to come into contact. In this case, because um, because the transmission rate is kind of like a composite of both the amount of contact you have with people and also the propensity of a virus to spread that's intrinsic, and also a factor of people's propensity to get it, um, and also the window of time in which this can happen, the length of the infectious period. Um, by reducing the amount of contact people have, you should be able to reduce this R value, this R naught. And it wouldn't really be R naught anymore. It would be kind of like a synthetic R naught. And let's see, R can vary as the pandemic goes on. This notion that R doesn't have to be a constant, it can be impacted by things that can change over time. The transmission rate can change over time. And of course, if you get this R below 1, then technically speaking, the number of cases should start to go down. Each person should, on average, infect less than one person. But of course, it's stochastic. So the reality is, when you get to very small numbers of cases, these models don't necessarily model things quite so well. So maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. So R2 below 1 and hence reduce the case numbers to low levels, or, as for SARS and Ebola, eliminate human-to-human transmission. So basically, yeah, you basically just get you just totally wipe it out. It doesn't have enough opportunities to transmit. So let's sort of discuss infeasibility of eliminating human-to-human transmission. Yeah, I was actually coming on to that. So one of the problems is reservoirs. So you can have reservoirs in infectious diseases where they keep coming back because there's a small subpopulation where R naught has not been brought down. So we're thinking about R naught in the general population has been brought down, but there's some very small component of R naught some very small component of a population where R naught is still quite high. So, for example, in the press, we've recently been hearing about social care homes and care homes in general, and how there's quite a lot of transmission within care homes, and there was a concern expressed by some medical professionals that they could reseed the epidemic, that corona in care homes could end up being like a reservoir that would then spread back into society once social distancing was lifted. And of course, other countries, international travel is exactly the same thing. We remember with the whole Brexit controversy that there was a great deal of discussion about how reliant we are of imports from Europe. But of course, those imports mostly come via lorries, which are roll on, roll off, and they have drivers, and those drivers can infect people. If you have people regularly coming in and out to move goods in and out of the country, there's an infection potential there. So unless you're willing to totally cut off trade for the period of a lockdown, or have some sort of very strict quarantine depot system which will massively disrupt the import and export of products, it's not really feasible to guarantee that you won't get reseeding of the infection, even if you're able to wipe it out in the majority of the population. You really would have to wipe it out everywhere, and you really would have to lock down the country to the point where it would basically become totally isolationist in order to have a decent chance of doing this. As we remember from the SPY-M studies, it has to be a total not a lockdown of people in their homes, but a lockdown of a nation and its trade in order to prevent that sort of thing from happening. So totally eliminating human-to-human transmission when we have so many asymptomatic cases, which is the other thing. Ebola is mostly not asymptomatic. There's a lot of people getting Ebola. They know they've got Ebola. The symptoms are quite distinct. But when you have asymptomatic cases coming in and out, screening is incredibly difficult. And so there's always going to be someone who slips through if you have any appreciable amount of asymptomatic individuals. So, yeah. The main challenges this approach is that NPIs and drugs, if available, need to be maintained at least intermittently for as long as a virus is circulating in the human population or until a vaccine becomes available. In the case of COVID-19, it will be at least 12 to 18 months before a vaccine is available. Furthermore, there is no guarantee that initial vaccines will have high efficacy. Right, so vaccination. Vaccination is extremely important in many diseases. It's one way of getting herd immunity without lots of people having to get sick. And as we know, in pandemics, herd immunity is what stops a pandemic. It's either herd immunity from people getting it or herd immunity from vaccines usually. But vaccine production is complicated. Generally speaking, for making an influenza vaccine, it means literally having rooms after rooms after rooms filled with eggs in incubators that have been injected with pathogens. And that's the easy way of making vaccines. Eggs could almost have been invented for culturing influenza vaccines in them. We don't have as good a systems necessarily for a hypothetical coronavirus. So because we regularly make influenza vaccines, we know that we can pump out a pandemic-specific vaccine, a vaccine specific to an influenza pandemic, not quickly, but we know that we can do it in a sensible time frame, in a time frame where if a pandemic drags on for most of a year, it's actually going to be useful. You know, we're talking about a 6 to 8 month timescale is what I've heard, often quoted. I think that was in the SPI-M report. But in any respect, we don't even know that we can make a vaccine for the coronavirus. There have been many other diseases where we haven't been able to make vaccines, and that's not because people can't become immune to them necessarily. It's just difficult to make the vaccine because it's highly mutagenic, perhaps, is one example. Although arguably you can always make a vaccine for something that's highly mutagenic, it's just it's mutated into something that you no longer have a vaccine for. And we know that there are multiple strains of COVID circulating in the UK. We believe that it's actually mutated to become more lethal, more infectious rather than more lethal, which is not good since it came from China. And we also believe that there are like several different strains that can be isolated geographically to different areas around Europe where it's been imported from. So we can actually trace back the different versions that we have. But yeah, so we know there's mutation. So far, we don't think there's been enough mutation that the immune system will not be able to fight it off. If it's seen one very like it, if it's seen a previous version, we think that there's cross immunity, cross-reactive immunity, that you see one of these and that you are then immune to all of them that are similar. But that may not always be the case. But again, something to be reassured about is that this prolonged process of mutation also tends to make viruses less lethal, we believe. So, but once you've got a vaccine, it's a production method. How do you make large amounts of it? I'm not so familiar with the production methods for vaccines outside of influenza, but generally speaking, it involves growing it in something. Or on something, some sort of cell culture, some sort of culture of something. And how do you scale that up? Particularly if it's an experimental vaccine. Some of these vaccines are designed in computers, put together chemically in a lab using genetic engineering, and then injected into specialist lab strains of cells, sometimes bacterial, sometimes mammalian, sometimes different insect cells, but whatever, they put them into cells and they grow them. And those sort of lab setups don't necessarily scale up very easily in scale. So that's why it's going to take 12 to 18 months for a vaccine to be made, we think, even if we get good ones now. And again, there's this question of efficacy. How much will it mutate between now and then? Just because we have a vaccine, it doesn't mean that the immune system is going to necessarily recognize that the immune system recognition of a vaccine is necessarily going to transfer over perfectly to the disease. Sometimes the vaccine doesn't stimulate the immune system enough. Sometimes the immune system develops an aversion to the vaccine, but the vaccine is dissimilar enough from the virus that that doesn't cross over into providing protection against the virus. So it has a lot to do with the antibodies that are produced, and um, and so it's possible for a poor vaccine now would be amazing, but a poor vaccine years from now, not so much. Um, anyway, mitigation. Here, the aim is to use NPIs, vaccines or drugs if available, not to interrupt transmission completely, but reduce the health impact of an epidemic, akin to the strategy adopted by some US cities in 1918. Okay, yeah, vaccines and drugs can be used to suppress. So you can adopt a hybrid strategy. You can you can use vaccination and drugs to an extent and you can use them basically. The thing about vaccines and drugs is you can basically use them as much as you have them. So if you have large stockpiles of a vaccine, if you have large stockpiles of drugs, you can just roll them out and use them over and over again, particularly antivirals. If you've got enough of them, you can just keep using them for as long as you need to. And as long as you scale up production relatively quick, even if your stockpile starts to run out, you can replenish it. Um, Vaccines, it's a lot more complicated, obviously. Um, but you can combine a kind of combined suppression and mitigation strategy where you fire off a load of vaccine as soon as you can. Poor quality vaccines, pre-pandemic vaccines is one term we often use, to kind of force down a pandemic, reduce the number of people who are available to spread it, and then use drugs to slow the rate that it spreads. But at the same time, you use the drugs in such a way that you still allow the pandemic to spread. So uh, we talked previously about responsive antiviral treatment, where you would wait until someone has it, and then you'd say, okay, you take this antiviral drug, and it will shorten the length of time you're ill for, therefore reduce the number of people you have it for. But they still get ill. They still get immunity from having had it. And maybe you give it to all the people in their home, but that slows the rate at which it spreads. But you don't have to give it to them indefinitely. They're still probably going to get it from somebody else eventually. But you slow the rate at which a virus spreads, and you flatten the curve using drugs. And that is more of a suppression strategy than a mitigation strategy, because if you can do that indefinitely, you can kind of push the curve quite far down. But at the same time, it's targeted in such a way that you're not trying to stop people getting the disease. It's hard to explain. You're not expending a huge amount of resources and effort purely on preventing people getting the disease. You are targeting your resources and efforts on making sure that those who have the disease do not easily spread it to other people. Um, and that some people are just taken out of the equation altogether, and they are just, then the pandemic won't exist so far as their health is concerned. And so it is possible to have these kind of combined approaches where, for example, maybe you vaccinate some high risk groups or some super spreaders, and you apply drugs to people who have the disease and might spread it, and might be at risk of dying from it. And you kind of have this combination of mitigation for some groups and suppression for others. Um, because the distinction between mitigation and suppression is pretty artificial, is what I'm trying to say here. Um, at the same time, what you're really trying to do is reduce transmission. You're trying to reduce transmission. Well, no, you're trying to reduce deaths. You are trying to reduce deaths without compromising the rate at which immunity builds. And it is possible to do both of those at the same time. Whereas mitigation is largely about trying to reduce deaths. I've got my tongue tied here, so you can tell I'm a bit tired tonight. I am not completely certain that the distinction and the terminology of mitigation and suppression makes sense. I do not think they are necessarily the correct terminology to describe and couch the decision that has been made, or to describe and explain the tools that are available to be used. That is what I am saying. But yes. So, akin to the, and by the world more generally in the 1957, 1968, and 2009 influenza pandemics. In the 2009 influenza pandemic, for instance, early supplies of vaccine were targeted at individuals with pre-existing medical conditions which put them at risk of more severe disease. In this scenario, population immunity builds up through the epidemic, leading to an eventual rapid decline in cases numbers and transmission dropping to low levels. So yes, what I'm saying is it's possible to apply a degree of mitigation and suppression. You can use some tools available to suppress the pandemic, to lengthen it, to flatten the curve, as it were. But you can also use some intelligently to try and reduce the impact of a high curve. That is what I'm saying. And it is possible to do both simultaneously, provided you have the medical therapies at your disposal. And the situation that we find ourselves in here is that we do not currently have the medical therapies at our disposal. And so this particular dichotomy, this apparent binary choice, is artificial. It is a product of the thinking that it is a product of that response to thinking in terms of purely what you can do through non-pharmaceutical interventions. If you start looking at pharmaceutical inventions, and you have a lot of them, and you have some useful ones and potent ones at your disposal, you can look at like hybrid approaches that both flatten the curve and also reduce the impact of a high curve simultaneously. Right. The strategies differ in whether they aim to reduce the reproduction number R to below 1 suppression and thus cause the numbers to decline, or merely slow the spread by reducing R. Well, no, a mitigation strategy still intends to cause R to decline, but it is intending to cause R to decline by building up herd immunity. So R can decline because the contact rate has dropped, the transmissibility has dropped massively, which is a temporary effect, or because there's fewer people to transmit to, which is a herd immunity effect. And so mitigation strategy still intends to reduce R, but through a different mechanism. Anyway, so, and there is this CUS case, yes, absolutely. So what we have seen recently is the social distancing strategy has indeed caused cases to drop, but not as quickly as I think you could honestly say you'd seen in some other countries. And actually, the drop in cases has been quite modest in some respects in the UK, and partly there might be something to do with the way the data is collected. Because obviously we have had people in hospital, and we've only been recording deaths in hospitals in the official statistics. There are other official statistics produced by the ONS that include deaths outside of hospitals, and they might be more revealing, but they lag behind by a week. However, it is quite possibly the case that close to the peak in early April, a lot of people in care homes were dying and being not admitted to hospital when they ordinarily would have. I know that there has been a great discussion about how the entire point of flattening the curve is to avoid having to triage the NHS, and there's also been talk in the press about how doctors would never leave people in care homes to die if they thought they needed treatment in hospital. They would only do it if they thought the treatment was pointless, if they really didn't have much hope of surviving. But I think, from what I've heard through gossip and through reading in the press, is that actually more people from care homes have been admitted to hospitals since the peak has dropped, since we've come away from the peak, which suggests to me that the reason that deaths may not be dropping in hospitals is perhaps because more of the deaths that would normally be happening in care homes are now happening in hospitals. So that's one possible explanation. Another possible explanation is that we haven't been as successful in reducing the R number as we thought, and I've seen recently, I think, a prediction saying that they believe it's been reduced to somewhere between 5 and 9. Well, sorry, 0.5 to 0.9, and an R number of 9.9 is not that great. You're not going to see a massive drop off there at that rate. And so this situation where you see deaths and you see cases and infections decline very gradually is a potential case. You can get very close to 1, either just slightly above or slightly below 1, where you get a more or less constant propagation of cases through the population. And obviously, if that goes on for long enough, you'll end up building up herd immunity. But of course, the question is, how long does that take? Time scales are very important in these sorts of considerations, as we will see. So yes, in this report we consider the feasibility and implications of both strategies for COVID-19. Looking at a range of NPI measures, it is important to note at the outset that given SARS-CoV-2 is a newly emergent virus, much remains to be understood about its transmission. In addition, the impact of many NPIs detailed here depends critically on how people respond to their introduction, which is highly likely to vary between countries and even communities. Last, it is highly likely that there would be significant spontaneous changes in population behavior, even in the absence of government-mandated interventions. Yeah, that's very much what you've seen in Sweden. People have told people to be sensible and to dial back going out of their homes, and they haven't cracked down with a lot of specific rules. And Sweden has, of course, been going through a mitigation strategy, as this paper would define it. but actually, people have been very circumspect and very cautious about doing things out in public. And actually, it is not business as usual in Sweden. It is very much a case of we kind of people are only going out as they feel they need to. They aren't abusing the privilege. They know that they are. They know that they need to kind of show some restraint, but at the same time, large aspects of life do continue. And yes, so and the other thing I think I point out is variation between community is pretty important. Look at what you saw in Paris, where people got so aggravated by the feeling that they were a forgotten bunch of people. I mean, you may have heard of a rioting that happened in Paris. It's been reported in the press recently, where poorer areas that have certain tensions with the police had some incidents with a young boy being knocked off his scooter in a police chase, and there was rioting because people felt like, we are under attack by the authorities. The lockdown is a form of attack. It's vindictive. We've been forgotten. We've been abandoned, and it's us versus them. And you do see this kind of notion that if you have communities that don't really feel like the country that they are in owns them and owns their problems and understands their problems and listens to their voices, then they're in many ways much less likely to be compliant, particularly if they are perhaps seeing the negative effects of lockdown much more than other areas, and maybe not necessarily seeing as many cases as some other areas, which is an interesting thing to think about. But anyway, I'm digressing quite a lot. We're meant to be talking about the modelling here more than anything else, I think. We do not consider the ethical or economic implications of either strategy here, except to note that there's no easy policy decision to be made. Suppression, while successful to date in China and South Korea, carries with it enormous social and economic costs, which may themselves have significant impact on health and well-being in the short and longer term. Yeah, so they're not assessing the health implications here. They're not assessing the health implications of what their policy would do. And one of the things that it occurs to me is we wouldn't consider, sadly, or not sadly, but you know what I mean, we would have great consternation if someone wanted to give out a vaccine without having tested it and determined how likely it was to have negative side effects. Because we give vaccines to huge numbers of people, and if something goes wrong with a vaccine, the negative impacts of that vaccine can be with those people for the rest of their lives, or indeed it may shorten their lives considerably, it may kill them. So people are rightly concerned about giving out vaccines without enough testing. But non-pharmaceutical interventions, just because they're called non-pharmaceutical, still have all of this potential to do harm. They can still cause lifelong health problems through mental health, through a number of different means. They can still they are still applied across the board to huge numbers of people, more than a vaccine would be, in fact. And so I think it's rather inappropriate to say that it's acceptable to advise that a non-pharmaceutical intervention is appropriate without looking at the negative health impacts, because you would never do that with a vaccine. You would never advise someone to use a vaccine in a pandemic situation without having looked at the negative health impacts of that vaccine. And I'm not convinced that you can say that it's any more appropriate to do so with a non-pharmaceutical intervention. But yes. Mitigation will never be able to completely protect those at risk from severe disease or death, and the resulting mortality may therefore still be high. Instead, we focus on feasibility, with a specific focus on the likely healthcare system impact of the two approaches would be. We present for Great Britain and the United States, but they are equally applicable to most high-income countries. So, talking about the transmission model, and I'm sure I put in a note about this, but it does seem to have disappeared. They use a microstate model. So what this is actually talking about, I'll go through this. We modeled an individual-based simulation model developed to support pandemic influenza planning to explore scenarios for COVID-19 in GB. The basic structure of the model remains as previously published. In brief, individuals reside in areas defined by high-resolution population density data. Contacts with other individuals in the population are made within households, at school, in the workplace, and the wider community. Census data were used to define age and household distribution size. Data on average class sizes and staff-student ratios were used to generate synthetic populations of school distributed proportional to local population density. Data on the distribution of workplace size was used to generate workplaces with commuting distances used to locate workplaces appropriately across the population. Individuals are assigned to each of these locations at the start of a simulation. So let's put that into context. What they're doing here is called a micro-simulation or an agent-based simulation. So what they have actually done is they have taken, they've basically made a mini virtual country. We have lots of little computer game characters, if you will, simulated people who belong to a particular workplace. They belong to a particular house. They belong to a particular community. They belong, and I think that's one of the iffiest one, because obviously there's overlaps within communities. They belong to a cluster of houses, that is to say, the houses of some of their family members and friends they're associated with, and there might be some visiting between houses, and that's built into the simulation. If they're children, they may belong to a school, and that sort of thing is kind of built into the model. Um, and they spend certain amounts of time in each of these environments, and they have a certain propensity, a certain contact rate in each of these environments with other people. And I imagine that will be somewhat delineated by age and gender and that sort of thing, perhaps. But and of course, they'll have an individual age assigned to them, an individual gender assigned to them, and all the various characteristics that might be considered might, or will be derived from demographic data. And they are literally going to try and simulate, or they have simulated, um, these individual agents moving between these different environments and stochastically, and that means by virtue of chance. They estimate a probability that something will happen and they roll a metaphorical or rather computer generated, as it were, dice. They get a probability number, a random number, and say, well, based on the probability that that this was going to there was going to be a contact event here and that it was going to spread, we assume it either has or hasn't spread to this other person. And that's how these kind of particular agent-based simulations can do, and they do it over and over again to build up a picture of what it looks like, so that they can get a kind of so that they can kind of look at how the noise and the randomness affects things. And that takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and it's a very impressive piece of work, I'd say. Having gone through the two papers that they quote, I find them very interesting, and it is indeed a very interesting approach. However, yeah, it's not very well described here. You really have to go and read the papers that they refer to. Transmission events occur through contacts made between susceptible and infectious individuals in either household, workplace, school, or randomly in the community, with the latter depending on spatial distances between contacts. So I think that might be something to do with the 2-meter rule. Per capita contacts within schools also probably takes into account population density. Per capita contacts within schools were assumed to be double those elsewhere in order to reproduce the attack rates in children observed in past influenza pandemics. With the parameterization above, approximately 1/3 of transmission occurs in these households, 1/3 in schools and workplaces, and the remaining third in the community. These contact patterns reproduce those reported in social mixing surveys. So there are these things called social mixing surveys, where you physically give people un momento. Mm. So where was I? Yeah, absolutely. So social mixing surveys are like these surveys where you give people a diary and you ask them to keep a record of who they've met in a given period of time, under what situations, what their age was, what they think the other person's age was. This sort of information is taken into account, and it was previously the best way of getting data available at the time on the way people would kind of come into contact with each other for the purposes of simulating pandemics. Something I noticed about this that I would have quite liked to have seen is them to include residential care facilities as an environment, because obviously the aging population is quite an important component of this. And really, at this stage, I would have really have liked to see some sort of inclusion in the model of care homes, and because they can be quite large, some of them, and there's a much higher rate of contact between people in care homes and, of course, the staff members in care homes. So it doubles both as a place of work and a place of residence, which is also quite unique. Um, and I think that would be a very interesting thing to add into this model, and perhaps something that I would have liked to have seen. We assume an incubation period of 5.1 days. Infectiousness is assumed to occur from 12 hours prior to the onset of symptoms, and for those that are symptomatic, from 4.6 days after infection. In those that are asymptomatic with an infectious profile over time, results in a 6.5-day mean generation time. Based on fits to the early growth rate of the epidemic in Wuhan, we make a baseline assumption that R0 equals 2.4, but examine values between 2 and 2.6. We assume that symptomatic individuals are 50% more infectious than asymptomatic individuals. Yep. So that is an assumption. I'm not quite sure if that's necessarily the case. Obviously, common sense says that if someone is coughing and spluttering a lot, they should be more symptomatic. Um, but you never know. Particularly respiratory conditions, if it's droplets breathed out rather than coughed out, if it's kind of aerosolized, then um, that's less obvious. It's doesn't necessarily track as precisely to symptoms like sneezing and coughing and that sort of thing. Um, Individuals' infectiousness is assumed to be variable. I mean, when you have one of these arbitrary numbers like 50%, where you have to assume a number, what we quite like to see is something called sensitivity analysis, where you try the number, you try the number and you try and see what happens if I make it a bit larger, what happens if I make it a bit smaller, how does it affect my results? Because sometimes the number just doesn't have much impact, and you only get very small changes. And you can say to yourself, well, actually, it doesn't really matter which number I chose. As long as it's in this rough range, it seems reasonable. The answer doesn't change very much. One of the things they're doing with R0 is picking a number of different numbers because they know that it is going to have a big impact. But it would be nice to hear some more and to see some more sensitivity analysis in this report as a general rule. It may be that sensitivity analysis was done and not published, but I would have liked to have seen it. So yes, individual infections is assumed to be variable, described by a gamma distribution with mean 1 shape parameter a.025. So what that means is they don't assume everyone has the same level of infectiousness. They've made an estimate of the average level of infectiousness based on the R0, but they're assuming that that varies somewhat from infected person to infected person. And they've come up with these with its distribution that describes it, a gamma distribution, which is a reasonable distribution to pick for something like that. But the choice of the shape parameter is pretty arbitrary. And again, it would be nice to see some sensitivity analysis here to see if it makes a big difference. On recovery from infection, individuals are assumed to be immune to reinfection in the short term. Evidence from the Flu Watch cohort study suggests that reinfection with the same strain of seasonal circulating coronavirus is highly unlikely in the same or following season. And actually, that's certainly consistent with what we see in non-pandemic coronavirus. I've been looking into this. You do tend to get alternating years. So if a coronavirus is quite big in one particular season, um, it doesn't tend to come back the next season. It tends to skip a year, and that sort of skipping of year process does seems to kind of end up with certain different strains of coronavirus alternating in given years, and it is an interesting question to it. Will will this coronavirus have to compete with other coronaviruses? Will it behave in the same way as seasonal coronaviruses? Because if so, we wouldn't expect it, after herd immunity has been achieved, we wouldn't expect it to be back the following year. We would expect to have at least some breathing room. And then you'd expect it to come back, but maybe not as fast, because there are a number of different ways that people can lose immunity to a virus. It can mutate. It can mutate so that the immune system no longer recognizes it. Also, the immune system's level of antibodies against a particular virus can drop to a level where reinfection is possible. Now, in those scenarios, the second infection is generally likely to be much less serious than the first, because the mutant is probably not as far away from the original strain as it could be, and there is always this possibility that having previously attacked the attacked the original strain, the body can adapt to attack the mutant. There is this recombinatorial process that cells go through as they develop, and the fact that there's some initial antibody that maybe has a poor blocking effect on the virus will slow it down enough that those cells that still retain that flexibility can mutate a bit and attempt to find a better antibody match to the new strain. The second thing is, of course, as I say, there's going to be some residual antibody there. There are cells that still remember how to make this antibody for the original strain, even if they've stopped producing them at the levels that they used to, and you can catch it again. The body doesn't necessarily, if it isn't a mutant strain, if it's the same strain again and you've just had a drop in antibody levels, the body doesn't have to learn how to make those antibodies again. It can ramp up production much more rapidly. And the combination of those two effects means that a secondary infection that you've already gained an immunity to, you're likely to do much better against in the second time around. And so even in the event of a second wave after herd immunity, you would hope that it would not be nearly as serious. If it comes back in 2 years' time, you would hope that people will handle it a lot better, that their immune systems will handle it a lot better than the first time around, even if the virus hasn't become less dangerous, which it may. Well, it could take a little bit longer than just 2 years. Yeah. Infection was assumed to be seeded in each country at an exponentially growing rate, with a doubling of time of 5 days from early January 2020, with the rate of seeding being calibrated to give local epidemics which reproduce the observed cumulative. Oh dear. I've just talked through a load of this video without the microphone on, haven't I? I feel like a prat. Right, where was I? So sensitivity analysis. It would have been quite nice to see some sensitivity analysis of the gamma distribution and the assumption about the asymptomatic individuals. It's often the case that when you have asymptomatic individuals, so when you have numbers that you're not 100% sure of and which seem a bit arbitrary, you can you can examine the reasonableness of those numbers by tweaking them a bit up and down and seeing if it makes a big difference. And if it doesn't make a big difference, and sometimes it doesn't, and you are reasonably certain that you're in the right ballpark, even if you've not got exactly the right number, you can say to yourself, well, I think this is fine. And so, just to go based upon what I've said before, the gamma distribution is a way of looking at how infectiousness is distributed statistically. So not everyone will have the average amount of infectiousness. Some people will have more, some people will have less. And the gamma distribution is a way of saying, well, how spread out is that around the average? And that's what the shape variable does. The assumption about 50% more people being infectious than asymptomatic individuals, people who are symptomatic are 50% more infectious than asymptomatic individuals. It seems fairly arbitrary, but it is based in common sense in the notion that if things are spread by coughs and sneezes, people who are symptomatic are coughing and sneezing. But of course, you do sometimes get aerosolized particles just coming up by breathing in some diseases. And if that were to be more of a factor, this would be less reasonable of an assumption, one might assume, but not necessarily, because again, there might just be more virus if you're symptomatic. Who knows? More virus in your lungs. Yes. Infection was assumed to be seeded in each country at an exponentially growing rate, with a doubling time of 5 days from early January 2020, with the rate of seeding being calibrated to give local epidemics which reproduce the observed cumulative number of deaths, GB, or US, seen by the 14th of March. Disease progression and healthcare demand. Analysis of data from China, as well as data from those returning on repatriation flights, suggests that 40 to 50% of infections were not identified as cases. This may include asymptomatic infections, mild diseases, and a level of under-ascertainment. We therefore assume 2/3 of cases are sufficiently symptomatic to self-isolate. It's a bit confusing how you go from 50 to 40% to 2/3, which is, probably more like 60%. Sorry, which is probably more like 33%. Because if 33% are not identified as cases, you would expect the remaining 66% to be identified as cases. So what they seem to be assuming here, in my note, they're assuming like maybe 7 to 17% of the unidentified cases were due to people who were deliberately hiding or ignoring their symptoms. And it's important to remember that this is a highly controversial figure that many academics cannot agree on. There have been figures published in perfectly respectable journals estimating the level of asymptomicity that vary from like 1% to 99%. And it's also one of the things that the Swedish approach has disagreed on, because they believe that there is a much higher level of asymptomicity. And the truth of the matter is, you won't really know. You won't really know until you go around and test a load of random people. But the problem is, testing a load of random people isn't easy, because, well, for starters, you need to get antibody tests, and those have been hard to do. And secondly, you need to know what antibodies to look for. So at the start of a pandemic, you don't necessarily know what antibodies to look for and how to detect them. And you really need a generic screen for all antibodies in a body. You need some sort of high throughput screening that can take all the antibodies in somebody's body and, in a sense, sort of classify them, so that you can look at that data retrospectively and improve it, and you can look at the collective data and kind of pick out trends and computationally look at which signatures in the data are going to correspond to COVID-19. And the facilities to do that don't really exist, because trying to dissect the total antibody profile of one person's body is technically complex. It would generally involve either taking a lot of blood and doing a lot of fairly complicated proteomics, which basically means processing of proteins, to kind of build large data sets based on their properties, based on their structure. Literally filtering, separating, and dissecting into pieces proteins and then analyzing their sequences, which is quite complex and time consuming for one person. The other approach you could take is to biopsy the cells that make the antibodies, and inside their DNA, because they all have slightly different strands of DNA, is a unique sequence that represents the instructions to make the antibody, and you could, hypothetically, sequence all of those cells. You could do high throughput sequencing and get a signature that way of what kinds of antibodies someone was producing. However, to do that, you'd have to take a biopsy, which means you have to go up to people who, in all probability, are quite healthy, and you've got to do quite a lot of people, probably thousands, quite a few thousand, perhaps, at the early stages in a pandemic, and say, can I stick this needle somewhere unpleasant and take a little bit of your flesh out, please? Just turn up on a random person's doorstep and ask that. And those are the only two ways I have been able to think of that you could kind of do this antibody screening at the very early stages of a pandemic at scale. And yeah. So it is very challenging, and it's understandable why people just cannot seem to agree on this number. And yeah, if the asymptomicity is high, it doesn't necessarily mean that the pandemic is that much less deadly, because that also may mean that you have to revise your estimate of R0 up. And some of the modelling I've seen that suggests a high level of asymptomicity also suggests a very high level of R0, which means it's going to be even harder to gain a herd immunity, and that the disease is going to be so much harder to suppress with social distancing. So yeah, it's quite complicated, and I will look maybe at some of these models that suggest that asymptomicity may be much higher than expected at another time. But suffice it to say that the criticisms that you can throw at all of the different places you have looked at to get these things. For example, this study, as I understand it, they've run the repatriation flights. What they did is they looked at people who'd recently returned to China from the rest of the world, and they then looked at how many of them subsequently caught COVID, and because they were, and that I think is, and they then use that, I think, to construct a prior about how many people out there had COVID-19 and do some Bayesian analysis. And the thing about Bayesian analysis, wasn't construct a prior? They did some Bayesian analysis, and the Bayesian analysis had to have in it a prior about how much infection. I will look at it in more detail later. But I do know that whenever you do Bayesian analysis, it's really, really sensitive to some of the assumptions you pick, particularly in terms of the priors. And it's not entirely clear exactly the mathematics that they have used in this paper, and I would benefit from going through it in more detail, and you may benefit at going through it in more detail, but it is one of several papers that have several disagreeing numbers on this. There was another one done on pregnant women, which demonstrated that a huge number of people allegedly had the virus but had no apparent symptoms, and again, quite small sample sizes. But then these number of people repatriated into China, also quite small sample sizes. So it's very difficult to say. Anyway. And a mean delay from onset of symptoms to hospitalization of 5 days. The age-stratified proportion of infection that requires hospitalization, and the infection fatality ratio, as opposed to the case fatality ratio. The infection fatality ratio is the probability of dying if you catch the disease, regardless as to whether you're symptomatic or not, regardless as to whether you go to hospital or not. It's just you caught the disease, this is your probability of dying. Were obtained from an analysis of a subset of cases from China. And I think they may have worked backwards from case fatality ratios as well. The mathematics used there, it's the same one as a plain study as I recall. Yeah. These estimates were correlated for non-uniform attack rates by age. So basically they said, okay, we know that this varies by age. So we'll kind of apply that variation into it. Because the sample that they got, right, the infection fatality ratios were obtained from a sample that had a lopsided age profile, or not necessarily lopsided, but they had to take into account the ages of the people in that study. And so I think what they're saying is that they then worked that out and adjusted for it and got a Great Britain population with an infection fatality ratio of about 0.9%, with a 4.4% of infections hospitalized. So, yeah, we assume that 30% of those that are hospitalized will require critical care. Based on early reports from COVID-19 cases in the UK, China, and Italy, based on expert clinical opinion, we assume that 50% of those in critical care will die. Based upon what I'm hearing from clinical experts whom I've been in contact with, I'm saying not clinical experts, clinical workers. They don't claim to be experts, but I have contacts in the healthcare service, people working in ICUs, and they seem to say that's about right. Once you've gone on a ventilator, at least, anyway. So yes, where were we? We assume that 30% of those that are hospitalized will require critical care. Invasive mechanical ventilation, or ECMO. That's a machine that literally pumps oxygen into your blood. It takes the oxygen out of your body, it takes the blood out of your body, pumps oxygen into it, and pumps it back in again. Based on early reports from COVID-19 cases in the UK, China, and Italy, and based on expert clinical opinion, we assume that 50% of those in critical care will die, and an age-dependent proportion of those that do not require critical care die. Yeah. It's worth noting that those people who do die in intensive care, I think, take quite a long time to die. Sadly, they have quite a slow end, by all accounts, and clinicians are saying they're putting people on ventilators. I hear for 14 days as many. It's 14 days, and then just having to turn them off because they think there's no hope for them. But that's a lot longer than people would normally be on ventilators, and it's known that it was expected that COVID-19 would have people on, as you see later in the text, you'll see they expected that to an extent. But it may be even larger than maybe they expected. Based on expert clinical opinion, we assume 50% of the time. We calculate bed demand numbers assuming a total duration of stay in hospital of 8 days if critical care is not required, and 16 days with 10 days in ICU if critical care is required. And I do think, from what I'm hearing, that some people, quite a lot of people, are spending more than 10 days on a ventilator, particularly if they're fatalities. With 30% of hospitalized cases requiring critical care, we obtain, but again, I don't have an official source of that. That is just what I've been hearing talking to clinicians. With 30% of hospitalized cases requiring critical care, we obtain an overall mean duration of hospitalization of 10.4 days, slightly shorter than the duration from hospital admissions to discharge observed in COVID-19 cases internationally, who will have remained in hospital longer to ensure negative tests at discharge, but in line with estimates for general pneumonia admissions. Current estimates of... Yes, let's just have a note here. Yep. Current estimates of severity of cases, the IFR estimates from Verity et al. Have been adjusted to account for the non-uniform attack rate, giving an overall IFR of 0.9. Hospitalization estimates also adjusted in this way and scaled to match the expected rates in oldest age group In the GB-US context, these estimates will be updated as more data accrues. So we're through the we're through the boring bit for those who don't like maths there. And we're already an hour and 15 minutes in, and I want to get through this bloody thing because I've been meaning to do this for ages, and yeah. Whew. We consider the impact of 5 different non-pharmaceutical interventions implemented individually and in combination. In each case, we represent the intervention mechanistically within the simulation using plausible and largely conservative pessimistic assumptions about the impact of each intervention and compensatory changes in contacts in the home associated with reducing contact rates in specific settings outside the household. The model reproduces the intervention effects seen in epidemiological studies and in empirical studies of contact patterns. 2 of the interventions, case isolation and voluntary home quarantine, are triggered by the onset of symptoms and are implemented the next day. So basically, if you're quarantined, if you know that someone in your household has symptoms and is likely to be sick with it, everyone stays in. They stay in, everyone else in the house stays in. And that's assumed at all times. It's assumed that people just do that because they've been told to, and it just makes good sense. Yep. The other 4 NPIs, social distancing of those over 70 years, social distancing of the entire population, stopping mass gatherings, and closing schools and universities, are decisions made at the government level. For these interventions, we therefore consider surveillance triggers based on testing of patients in critical care, intensive care units. We focus on such cases as testing is most complete for the most severely ill patients. So basically, with a limited amount of scope for testing, people in ICU are those who are being tested for COVID-19 with a good degree of consistency. And the reason that's being done, one of the things that's being used for is trying to estimate the number of people with COVID-19 in ICU, to estimate how much of ICU's capacity is being taken up by people with COVID-19. And the assumption is that, and one of the reasons that's being done is because they are going to look at here what would happen if they change government policy based upon the number of people in ICU at any one time who have tested positive for COVID-19. They talk about an on threshold and an off threshold. So you get an on threshold, and maybe you consider implementing a policy, and then you get to an off threshold, and then you might consider ending the policy. So we'll look at that in more detail in a minute. We examine mitigation strategies. We assume policies are enforced for 3 months. This will be mitigation. We focus on cases. When examining mitigation strategies, we assume that policies are enforced for 3 months, other than social distancing of those over the age of 70, which is assumed to remain in place for 1 month longer. Suppression strategies are assumed to be in place for 5 months longer. So at this point, they're not looking at triggers, they're just looking at set windows of time for things to be in place. 5 months or longer. So case isolation is literally what we just talked about. It's literally just staying at home. And they are assuming that 70% of households will comply with this policy. I think they probably got more compliance than that, to be honest with you. I think for those symptomatic individuals, I think the level of compliance is probably a good deal higher than that. It'd be worth modelling that in. Maybe a bit of sensitivity analysis about that parameter might not go amiss. Voluntary quarantine. Following identification of a symptomatic case, all households remain at home for 14 days. Household contact rates double during the quarantine period. Contacts in the community reduced by 75%. Assume 50% of households comply with a policy. So that's actually just your family members, the people who live with you, also agreeing to stay home if you're ill. And they're assuming only 50% of people will comply with that. Again, I think it might be a good deal more than that. social distancing of those aged over 70, reduce contact of 50% in workplaces, increase household contacts by 25%, and reduce other contacts by 75%, assume 75% compliance with policy. I have no idea. Social distancing of entire population. So this is a big one. This is a lockdown, more or less. And it's worth noting here that they don't really talk about lockdown. What we do, we'll see. All households reduce contact outside of household, school or workplace by 75%. So they haven't really dissected these policies and said, well, we think this one particular aspect of social distancing will have this impact on reducing contact. They're just saying, we just want you to reduce this contact by a certain amount. And we haven't necessarily linked the contact reduction to particular classes of behaviour. So we haven't gone through and said, oh, well, if people are allowed to exercise twice a day, it's going to increase contact rates by this amount. And if people are allowed to be more than so many meters apart in a supermarket, it'll affect contact rates by this other amount. They've not tried to be that specific, and it's understandable why they haven't, but at the same time it's quite hard to then necessarily know how to implement that in a policy advice. It's difficult to know how far you have to go in order to get that 75% reduction. And again, yeah, they don't actually say how much compliance they assume, I notice. School contact remains the same. Household contact rates assumed to increase by 25%. And every other category, they say what they assume the compliance with a policy is. They don't mention what they assume the compliance with a policy is on social distancing. That's interesting. Closure of schools and universities. Closure of all schools, 25% of universities remain open, which is a lot more than we actually have open, I think. 25% of universities remain open? Not really. Maybe 25% of staff may remain on campus, keeping things ticking over. I think it's probably less than that. Yeah, that's interesting. Household contact rates for student families increased by 50% during closure. Contacts in the community increased by 25% during the closure. So they aren't really expecting students to stay in that much, I guess. I don't know. Results. In the unlikely absence of any control measures or spontaneous changes in individual behaviour. So again, they freely admit that they would expect people to be more sensible and react by being more circumspect about their social contact. We would expect a peak in mortality to occur after approximately 3 months. In such scenarios, given an estimated R0 of 2.4, we predict 81% of Great Britain and US populations would be infected over the course of the epidemic. That's quite believable. That's pretty much what we would have expected for influenza, more or less, I think, about 4/5. Is not unusual for these really. Well, no, it depends on the level of case attack, actually. So yeah, no, that's quite believable. Epidemic timings are approximate given the limitations of surveillance data in both countries. The epidemic is predicted to be broader in the US than in GB and to peak slightly later because, of course, it's just a larger area and it's more sparsely populated. This is due to that's what they say. This is due to the larger geographic scale of the US, resulting in more distant, localized epidemics across states than seen across GB. The higher peak in mortality in GB is due to the smaller size of the country and its older population compared with the US. In total, in an unmitigated epidemic, we would predict approximately 510,000 deaths. Now, let's try to get that in some context in predictions. I think I worked through the numbers on this, and this is something like 1%, slightly less than 1% of the population. So imagine you maybe know 1 or 2 people personally who will die. They say they have what's that number? They say Facebook used to not allow you to have more than a certain number of friends or something like this. But really, the number of friends that you can actually keep track of is something like a couple hundred, something like that. Um, and so, um, realistically speaking, in your personal circle of people you would know the names of, people you wouldn't have to look up who they are um, in your circle. Um, Even they may not be particularly close, they may just be acquaintances, someone you occasionally do business with, someone who was maybe in your class at school, but you still talk to them every now and again. There's probably maybe one or two people who die. And so pretty much everyone would be touched by this pandemic. But on the other hand, statistically speaking, they're very much likely to be elderly people. So, yeah, tragically. Um, so you can see that it's not a massive impact upon society as a whole, but it's a massive human tragedy. And obviously, I think if you look at the number of people in a more kind of population level, that's a group of people slightly smaller than the population of the Belfast urban area, I believe, something like that. It's on those sorts of scale. It's the size of a small city. Yeah, and 2.2 million in the US, not accounting for the potential negative effects of healthcare systems being overwhelmed on mortality. So that is assuming that everyone gets an ICU bed, which they wouldn't. Um, For an uncontrolled epidemic, we predict critical care bed capacity will be exceeded as early as the second week in April, with an eventual peak in ICU or critical care bed demand that is over 30 times greater than the maximum capacity in both countries. Um, and actually, I think they later say with mitigation it would be more like 8 times greater. But of course, that doesn't account for things like the Nightingale hospitals that have been built. But even that's not, you know. The aim of mitigation is to reduce the impact of an epidemic by flattening the curve, reducing peak incidence and overall deaths. Since the aim of mitigation is to minimize mortality, which, to be honest, is really minimize mortality is a little bit more complicated than that. The intervention needs to remain in place for as much of the epidemic as possible. Introducing such interventions too early risks allowing transmission to return once they are lifted, if sufficient herd immunity has developed. It is therefore necessary to balance the timing of introduction with the scale of duration of disruption imposed and the likely period which the interventions can be maintained. And in this scenario, interventions can limit transmission to the extent that little herd immunity is acquired, leading to the possibility that a second wave of infection is seen once the interventions are lifted. So you can be the victim of your own success. If you're so good at suppressing an epidemic, again, it can just come back again as previously described. But you can see this red line here is the number of people, the number of beds we had at the start of a pandemic in ICU. And this is what they thought we would need at the peak, the black curve, if you did nothing, which is highly, highly unlikely to have been the case. It's probably going to have been much, much closer to the green or orange curves if nothing had been done. But again, hard to say. But even the most aggressive one, which is case isolation, home quarantine, and social distancing of over 70, so that's just over 70s being asked to stay at home, still had that quite massive distance there. Mitigation strategies for GB showing critical care bed ICU requirements. The black line shows you a mitigated epidemic. The green line shows a mitigation strategy incorporating closure of schools and universities. Orange line shows as case isolation. The yellow line shows isolation of household quarantine, and the blue line shows case isolation, home quarantine, and social distancing of those aged over 70. The blue shading shows a 3-month period in which these interventions are assumed to remain in place. Table 3 shows a predicted impact of both deaths and ICU capacity of a range. Table 3 shows a predicted relative impact on both deaths and ICU capacity of a range of single and combined NPI interventions applied nationally in Great Britain for 3 months for a 3 month period based on triggers of between 100 and 3,000 critical care beds, conditional on that duration. So basically, that's when you trigger it, when you have either 100 or 3,000 critical care cases in ICU with COVID-19. The most effective combination of interventions is predicted to be the combination of case isolation, home quarantine, and social distancing of those most at risk, over 70s, whilst the latter has relatively less impact on transmission than other age groups. Reducing morbidity and mortality in the highest risk groups reduces both demand on critical care and overall mortality. In combination, this intervention strategy is predicted to reduce peak critical care demand by 2/3 and halve the number of deaths. However, this optimal mitigation strategy would still result in an 8-fold higher peak demand on critical care beds over and above the available surge capacity in both GB and US. Now, I have to wonder in these figures, and it is ambiguous, when it talks about halving the number of deaths, is that with or without the adjustment for the number who would die as a result of not getting critical care because of the excess of care beds? That would have been good to clear up. Overall, we find that relative effectiveness of different policies is insensitive to the choice of local trigger, that is to say, how many cases. Variation in R0 and variation in the case fatality rate. So they did some sensitivity analysis there. They looked at what varying those numbers would actually do. So this is your mitigation options. And again, the total number of deaths. So these percentage numbers are the total number of deaths averted. So lower numbers mean more people die. And so the percentages of the number of lives saved. Now look at this. This is, I find, quite interesting, and I think I've made a note of this here, which is good. Yeah, school closure actually makes the number of deaths worse. So, you notice here, this is the number of deaths in the 2 scenarios looked at. And if you close schools, that's the last common here, and have case isolation, quarantine people who live with cases, and socially distance the over 70s, and close schools, you actually have a less impact on reducing the number of deaths than you do if you do all these things but don't close schools. And that's very counterintuitive, you might imagine. And I believe that they are reporting figures that include a second wave that they haven't put on this graph. I believe that they are reporting a second hump later on down here somewhere in these figures, because that would make sense because of the next graph that you will see where they show a different strategy and they show what happens when the social distancing is released. And you see the more aggressively it's suppressed, the higher the second wave. And so I imagine that this successful suppression, this really, really successful suppression where during this period they've pushed it all the way down to this blue curve, just means it bounces back higher later on and causes more deaths, ironically. Given that mitigation is unlikely to be a viable option without overwhelming healthcare systems, suppression is likely necessary in countries able to implement the intensive controls required. Our projections show that to be able to reduce R close to 1 or below, a combination of case isolation, social distancing of the entire population, and either household quarantine or school and university closures are required. Measures are assumed to be in place for a 5-month duration, not accounting for the potential adverse effects on ICU capacity due to absenteeism. So the assumption being that if you have lots of people off work, you might end up not having enough doctors to run ICUs. Well, that's ignored. School and university closures is predicted to be more effective in achieving suppression than household quarantine. All four interventions combined are predicted to have the largest effect on transmission. Such an intensive policy is predicted to result in a reduction in critical care requirements from a peak approximately 3 weeks after the interventions are introduced and a decline thereafter while the intervention policies remain in place. While there are many uncertainties in policy effectiveness, such a combined strategy is the most likely one to ensure that critical care bed requirements would remain within surge capacity. So here they have this lovely little diagram where they show you the unmitigated scenario, the surge capacity, and then the two cases they're considering, which is case isolation and household quarantine and general social distancing, and this one is school and university closure, case isolation, and general social distancing. Well, actually, this also has how. So this, as you can see, this green line here never goes above never goes above the capacity of the ICUs during the policy implementation period. And the orange line, which is social distancing without school closures, that does, but not nearly as much as a big, massive curve here. But notice the difference between what happens afterwards. This one spikes up like this as soon as it's released. The one that was suppressed even more has an even more dramatic and aggressive spike, which is one of the effects you often see. Well, this note here is apparently blank, so I don't know why that's there. Yeah, but this is another interesting point I want to make, actually. One of the things we're hearing about a lot is the effect of these policies, the lockdown policies, on mental health. And it occurred to me that no one, as far as I'm aware, has looked at mental health bed capacity. And I know for a fact that we often find ourselves in a situation where patients who are sectioned under the Mental Health Act, which is something the government has now made easier to do because they do worry about people who have mental health issues being left alone in the community without as much supervision as they normally get, and what the consequences might be. It's easier to section them, but that doesn't necessarily imply that there's anywhere to put them. Because as I understand it, the number of specialist mental health beds that can take sectioned individuals is quite close to capacity under normal operating conditions. And it has not been unusual for patients who have been sectioned every now and again to find themselves spending some time on ordinary hospital beds, in acute wards, in general wards, which isn't necessarily the end of the world if it's just one or two patients and they have some well-trained hospital staff looking after them quite carefully, and if they carefully select those cases that get put in those beds to be the ones that maybe need the less intensive care. But if you were to get a surge in people being sectioned under the Mental Health Act, well, how can you guarantee that you would have enough capacity in the system to section them? I mean, if they all get put in ordinary hospital beds in relatively, if you end up having a number of people in the same ward with mental health issues, which is entirely plausible under this current situation, I believe, would the staff be able to control them? Would they be able, not to control them, would they be able to watch them to make sure that they don't hurt themselves or hurt others? Because obviously people are only sectioned, as a general rule, people are usually sectioned because they're a danger to themselves or others. And if there were to be an uptick in the number of people needing to be sectioned because they were a danger to themselves or others, would them being kept, the normal number being kept in ordinary hospital beds, not potentially lead to safety issues inside hospitals, both for individuals themselves, but also both for patients themselves, but also for other individuals working and receiving treatment in the hospitals? So that's something that concerns me. And might that lead to reluctance on doctors' parts to section people? Might we find them being returned to the community on the basis that a doctor just isn't willing to section someone if he doesn't think there's somewhere suitable to put them. It's not inconceivable. Um, so that's interesting to me, and it would have been interesting to look at, but obviously they haven't really included the effects of lockdown in their in the scope of their report, and that is something that I would very much be interested to hear more about personally. Suppression strategies for Great Britain shows ICU bed requirements, Black Line shows. So we've been through that. Adding wholesale quarantine to case isolation and social distancing is the next best option, although we predict that there is a risk that surge capacity may be exceeded under this policy option. Combining all four interventions, social distancing is predicted to have the largest impact, short of a complete lockdown, which additionally prevents people going to work. And given that they're already looking at some really extreme cases, it's interesting that they mentioned this specifically, and it sounds like they might have modelled it. And if it has been modelled, why hasn't the data been included in the report? It's interesting. It's as if the government really wanted that taken off the table before it even got to the report stage almost. You could make that inference. Once interventions are relaxed in the example in Figure 3, from September onward, infections begin to rise, resulting in a predicted peak epidemic later in the year. I want to go back to this diagram, sorry. I think it's extremely illustrative and I want to talk about it. We've heard the Prime Minister talk about a tunnel under the Alps, and this social distancing, this lockdown, has been a bit like a tunnel under the Alps. I think that's a poor analogy. I think a good analogy is it's like a bulldozer pushing a hill. You've got a huge mound of dirty earth in front of you, and you're in a bulldozer that is stuck going forward. It's like speed or something. You can't slow it down. And so all you can do is push the earth in front of you, and a tiny, tiny amount of that mound of earth is slipping out underneath a plough, and you're driving over it. And at that rate, it's going to be in front of you forever. And so, what are your options? You can't stop the bulldozer. You can keep going and hope that the bulldozer doesn't break. It doesn't have an infinite amount of petrol. It doesn't have. It's under a great deal of strain. At some point, it may break down. You could be stuck in a situation where you're just there with this earth and you can't get away from it. And then it goes badly. You can lift the plough somewhat more and try and get through the earth, but you're going to get dirty. To whatever degree you lift the plough, you know you're going to get dirty. Or you can start swerving around like a maniac, and try and get around the pile of earth, but that risks destabilizing the bulldozer, and it's high risk. And so these strategies would roughly relate to accepting that you're going to have a number of deaths and that you can't reasonably control that, and lifting the plough, and you allow a certain amount of cases to come through on the grounds that you need to get through this period. You keep down with the plough down and keep driving, but then there's a risk that it gives out, something gives out, and you end up with all the dirt in your face anyway. Or you start taking really, really extreme measures, like treating the population like guinea pigs and experimenting on them, using experimental therapies, which may not necessarily be totally untested, but certainly haven't had the level of testing that you would have expected under normal circumstances. And these are your three bad options, and unfortunately there are no good options. Pandemics are about choosing the least bad option, and you need to make a decision, and that is the reality we are in. We can keep going and going and going and going, and we don't. And we'll talk a bit later about how long that might take with a lockdown strategy, or you can accept a certain amount of dirt, and you can get through the dirt, which in this case is a certain number of deaths, a higher number of deaths than people would be comfortable with, that's for sure, even if it's not nearly as bad as a totally unmitigated scenario. Or you turn the population into lab rats. And those are your options, as far as I'm concerned. If someone has a better idea, they can, the government would love to hear from you, I'm sure. So, yeah. Once the interventions are relaxed, in the example in Figure 3 from September onwards, infections begin to rise, resulting in a predicted peak epidemic later in the year. The more successful strategy is at temporary suppression, the larger the later epidemic is predicted to be in the absence of vaccination, due to a lesser buildup of herd immunity. Yeah, and if you look at this particular timing, it's right in the middle of winter, where ICU beds are going to be taken up by winter flu cases as well. It's not ideal. Given suppression policies may need to be maintained for many months, we examined the impact of an adaptive policy in which social distancing plus school closures, and it is only initiated after weekly confirmed cases in ICU patients, a group of patients highly likely to be tested, exceeds a certain on threshold. So basically, once we have a certain number of people in ICUs who are COVID-19 confirmed, we implement the policies, we implement the lockdown. And is then relaxed when ICU cases fall below a certain off threshold. So basically, the lockdown ends and ICU cases get to a certain level. Case-based policies on home isolation of symptomatic cases and household quarantine are continued throughout. Such policies are robust to uncertainties in both reproduction number and in the severity of a virus. That is to say, the proportion of cases requiring ICU admission, not shown. Table 3 illustrates that suppression policies are best triggered early in the epidemic, with a cumulative total of 200 ICU cases per week being the latest point at which policies can be triggered and still keep peak ICU demand below GP surge limits. In the case of a relatively high R0 value of 2.6, expected total deaths are also reduced for lower triggers. Though deaths for all the policies considered are much lower than for an uncontrolled epidemic. The right panel of Table 4 shows social distancing plus university school closures need to be enforced for the majority of the 2 years of the simulation, but that the proportion of times these measures are enforced is reduced for more effective interventions and for lower values of R0. So basically they're saying you'll be in lockdown 2/3 of the time for 2 years in this strategy, is what they're saying, in the worst case. Table 5, now that's actually misleading, and I'll go through why I think that's misleading in a minute. Table 5 shows that total deaths are reduced with lower off triggers. However, this also leads to longer periods which social distancing is in place. So basically you can save more lives if you're more reluctant to end a lockdown, but you spend a lot more time in lockdown. Peak ICU demand and the proportion of time social distancing is in place are not affected by the choice of the off trigger. And so you get this cyclical thing here. So this is these blue windows represent the time that you were in lockdown, and they assume a 5-month period, I believe, to start off with, and then they have the on and off triggers working as per normal. Okay. So this is my concern about this. This simulation only lasts for 2 years, and the figures that they report are only for the simulation over 2 years. So it doesn't really tell you how long this thing needs to go on for. It doesn't tell you, for example, whether or not, it doesn't tell you when the on and off triggers would have to end, and how much of the herd immunity you've built up over this 2-year period. So So illustrating of adaptive triggering of suppression strategies for R0 2.2, that's the weakest case. No, that's the average case they consider. A policy of all 4 interventions considered on-triggers and off-triggers. Yeah, this policy is in it before. So these are your windows, your brief windows where lockdown is abated. So this is this is a table that they look at, and it's important to note here that yeah, there's no indication of how long this policy has to last. The 2-year limit is just an arbitrary assumption, and if it's an assumption about when the vaccine will be available, they really should have done some sensitivity analysis about when the vaccine will be available, and indeed included a no vaccine available case. But they haven't done that. So these deaths are only reported are only for that 2-year period. So you notice here that, as you would expect, total deaths are much, much less if you have all these very aggressive intervention strategies in place. However, I wonder if if you were to continue the simulation under the assumption that at the end of the 2 years the lockdown stopped and no matter what it never came back again, would these figures normalize to be much closer to these figures over here? Would you get an nth wave, a wave after the final release of the lockdown? Is there still enough uninfected people, enough susceptible people in the population after that 2-year period to get you a decent, nasty, late pandemic if you were to release it? Is this strategy so successful that it suppresses the acquisition of herd immunity for a whole 2-year period? If that's the case, then you're not necessarily in any better situation at the end of that 2-year period than you were at the start, not necessarily. And it would be really interesting to see what the death rates would have been if they'd assumed that their policy continues until such a point that the on-trigger is never needed again. And it would be nice to see them report that number, and it should have been possible to do this, to report what date, based on their assumption, would you never need to invoke the on-trigger again, assuming there was no vaccine. How many years? Because if it's 4, 5, 6, I don't think anyone in their right mind seriously believes that the population could tolerate such a long period of restriction. People talk about the new normal, but reality is it isn't normal and people aren't going to adapt to it to that level. Eventually people are going to want to go back to normal, and sooner or later. And yeah, it's interesting. If it were the case that you had to continue the policy for quite a long time, or that even if you did continue these policies to their natural conclusions, you still had comparable death rates, or maybe death rates that weren't so different, then I would say potentially. But this is very misleading. That information should definitely be included, and I'm quite concerned that it wasn't, because it is entirely feasible to have an intervention that's so successful that it just pushes a problem ahead of you, even up to multiple years. And that possibility doesn't seem to have been worked into these numbers. The numbers have been presented in such a way as to not disguise, that implies intent, but certainly in such a way that that aspect of the simulation of a problem isn't presented. Yeah, so I'm going to call it a day there because I don't know if YouTube will allow me to stream for over 2 hours. And I am getting very, very tired, and there's a lot more to talk about. I'm going to come back to this tomorrow. I may find that I've missed things out, and I will have a second go at maybe recovering some parts earlier on, but I may have skipped over too quickly. Right. All things said, I'm very disappointed I wasn't able to finish this in one night. I'm very disappointed that I've not been very organised, but it's been a bit complicated life at the moment, and I hope that you are all in very good health. I am only trying to give you the information that you need to make sensible decisions and to inform yourselves, and I hope that that's useful and valuable to you. And yeah, I will be back at it tomorrow to discuss it in more detail. And maybe at some point it would be nice to go through some of the other papers. But I think this one really deserved the attention that it's getting, because this paper basically precipitated the lockdown. And I think that that's a huge, huge deal, and that it deserves to be scrutinized, and the public need to have a good understanding of it. Stay, yeah, have a good one.